On August 19, 1942, deep within the dense jungle near Taivu Point on Guadalcanal, Second Lieutenant Genjiro Imi of the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company recorded in his diary the growing disbelief among Japanese soldiers. Through a choking canopy of palms and strangling vines, Imi and 916 men of Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's detachment had landed from destroyers under cover of darkness. Japanese command believed this would be the first step toward recapturing Henderson Field, the airstrip recently seized by American Marines. They had been told the enemy numbered perhaps 2,000 men, soft, inexperienced, and easily frightened. Colonel Ichiki, a battle-hardened veteran of campaigns in China and Southeast Asia, dismissed every caution. "They are Americans," as he told his officers confidently. "We will sweep them into the sea before sunrise." What Ichiki and his men did not yet realize was that they were about to encounter something wholly unprecedented in their military experience, not merely defeat, which to them was unthinkable, but the systematic collapse of every tactical and ideological certainty that had defined the Imperial Japanese Army since 1937. The jungle itself would turn against them. The darkness, once their greatest ally, would betray them, and in that crucible they would discover the devastating power of American coordination, technology, and firepower, forces that would shatter the myth of Japanese invincibility in close combat. That transformation had begun 12 days earlier, on August 7, 1942, when 11,000 Marines of the U.S. 1st Marine Division, under Major General Alexander A. Vandegrift, stormed ashore at Lunga Point. Operation Watchtower, the first major American offensive of the Pacific War, seemed straightforward on paper: seize the nearly completed Japanese airfield, build a defensive perimeter, and hold until relieved. In reality, the Marines were stepping into the longest, most punishing campaign in the history of the Corps, a struggle not only against a determined enemy, but against the island itself. Guadalcanal stretched roughly 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, its mountainous spine rising nearly 8,000 feet into perpetual clouds. The coastal plain surrounding the airfield was a tangle of kunai grass, swamp, and thick jungle where visibility often dropped to a few feet. The heat exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and humidity rarely fell below 90%. Clouds of mosquitoes were so dense that men inhaled them. The rivers that sparkled in reconnaissance photographs were teeming with parasites. Within weeks, malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and tropical ulcers would disable more Marines than enemy gunfire. By October, nearly two-thirds of U.S. forces on the island were unfit for combat. Yet fortune favored them in the beginning. When the Marines reached the half-finished airfield, they found it almost undefended. Some 2,200 Japanese construction workers and 600 naval troops fled into the jungle, leaving behind valuable supplies, machinery, and, most importantly, the airstrip itself. By the evening of August 8th, American engineers were already completing the runway. They named it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway. Within days, the first F-4F Wildcats and SBD Dauntless dive bombers landed, forming the nucleus of what would become the legendary Cactus Air Force, named for the Allied code word for the island, cactus. The Japanese response was swift and devastating. On the night of August 9th, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa led 7 cruisers and a destroyer into the narrow waters off Savo Island. In one of the most skillful night attacks in naval history, his force struck the Allied fleet guarding the transports. Within an hour, 4 heavy cruisers, the USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and HMAS Canberra, were ablaze and sinking. More than 1,000 sailors died in the burning sea. It was the worst defeat in United States Navy history. The surviving ships withdrew, taking with them the bulk of supplies that had not yet been unloaded, leaving the Marines stranded on shore with barely half their food and ammunition. What the Japanese High Command failed to grasp in those critical August days was that Henderson Field had become the key to the entire Solomon Islands campaign. Whoever controlled the airfield controlled the daylight, and in those seas, daylight meant dominance. Aircraft operating from Henderson Field could strike any Japanese ship within roughly 200 miles, 320 kilometers, a single fact that would dictate the entire nature of the Guadalcanal Campaign. The Japanese might dominate the night, running supplies and reinforcements aboard destroyers in desperate missions the Americans dubbed the Tokyo Express. But when dawn came, American aircraft ruled the skies, and any vessel caught in daylight risked annihilation. To retake the airfield before American defenses solidified, Imperial General Headquarters assigned the task to Lieutenant General Harukichi Hayakutake's 17th Army, based at Rabaul on New Britain. Hayakutake's forces, however, were spread across thousands of miles. The 35th Infantry Brigade, under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, was still on Palau. The 4th Infantry Regiment was garrisoned in the Philippines, and the nearest unit, Colonel Kiyono Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment, had been stationed near Guam, originally intended for the canceled Midway operation following Japan's catastrophic naval defeat in June. Colonel Ichiki was a respected infantry instructor and a capable tactician, but he was also impulsive and deeply convinced of Japanese spiritual superiority in combat. To him, Bushido, the warrior code, mattered more than logistics or firepower. He believed that the ferocity of Japanese soldiers could overcome any technological advantage. Before leaving Truk Lagoon for Guadalcanal, Ichiki was explicitly ordered to wait for the rest of his regiment before attempting to retake Henderson Field. But Ichiki, like many officers of his generation, held American soldiers in low regard. He had studied battle reports from China, Malaya, and the Philippines, where Western troops had surrendered quickly. To him, the Americans were undisciplined and soft, unworthy opponents for the Imperial Army. On the night of August 18, 1942, 6 destroyers landed 917 men, the first element of Ichiki's force, at Taivu Point, about 15 miles east of the American perimeter. The landing went smoothly and undetected. Ichiki immediately dispatched reconnaissance patrols to probe the marine defenses, a routine tactical decision that would soon prove disastrous. The next day, August 19th, a patrol from Company A, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, under Captain Charles Brush, was moving along the coastal trail near Coley Point when they spotted Japanese soldiers. A short, violent firefight erupted in the jungle. The Marines killed 31 Japanese soldiers and recovered valuable documents revealing the presence of a larger enemy force nearby. Even more alarming, the captured papers made clear that the Japanese severely underestimated American strength, believing there were only a few thousand Marines on the island, when in fact more than 11,000 were entrenched around Henderson Field. Captain Brush rushed back to report his findings. General Alexander Vandegrift, the Marine commander, immediately recognized what was coming, a Japanese assault from the east. He ordered Colonel Clifton Cates to fortify defenses along the sandbar at the mouth of a river the Marines misidentified as the Tenaru, actually the Ilu River. Cates positioned Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines along the riverbank, with machine guns and 37mm anti-tank guns arranged to create deadly interlocking fields of fire across the open sandbar. Colonel Ichiki, unaware of how well prepared the Americans were, chose to attack without delay. On the night of August 20th to 21st, he ordered a frontal assault straight across the sandbar. Japanese doctrine prized night attacks, believing that courage and surprise could overcome superior enemy firepower. Ichiki's men fixed bayonets and advanced under the cover of darkness, confident they would sweep the Americans away. Shortly before midnight, a Solomon Island scout named Jacob Vuza stumbled into Marine lines. He had escaped Japanese captivity after enduring hours of brutal torture and brought a desperate warning. The Japanese were coming. Moments later, the night exploded with gunfire. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers charged across the sandbar, shouting battle cries and hurling grenades. They ran straight into the killing zone the Marines had engineered with mathematical precision. The M1917 A1 Browning water-cooled machine guns opened fire, their rhythmic chugging filling the humid air. Each gun could fire up to 600 rounds per minute indefinitely as long as its water jacket was kept cool. The Marines' overlapping fields of fire meant that no inch of the sandbar was safe. Japanese troops fell in waves, torn apart by .30 caliber bullets and canister shells from 37mm anti-tank guns, essentially giant shotguns that shredded men at close range. Those few who managed to cross the sandbar reached the Marine line only to face hand-to-hand combat. Marines fought with rifles, knives, entrenching tools, and bare fists. But the line held. By dawn, Ichiki's attack had completely collapsed. The river was choked with bodies. More than 800 Japanese dead lay in the shallow water and on the sand. When the sun rose, General Vandegrift ordered a counterattack. 5 F-3 Stuart light tanks lumbered across the sandbar, systematically flushing out the wounded and survivors hiding in the coconut groves. War correspondent Richard Tregaskis, observing from a Marine position, wrote, "It was fascinating to see them bustling among the trees, pivoting, turning, spitting sheets of yellow flame. We had not realized there were so many Japanese in the grove." The tank's canister rounds turned every thicket into a killing ground. By midday on August 21st, the Battle of the Tenaru was over. Of the 917 Japanese who had landed at Taivu Point, roughly 800 were dead, and most of the remaining 128 survivors fled into the jungle. A few radioed headquarters to report the disaster. Among the dead was Colonel Kiyono Ichiki himself. Japanese records claim he burned his regimental colors and committed ritual suicide, though Marine witnesses believed he died leading a final charge. American losses were minimal, about 40 killed or wounded, but the psychological impact was enormous. For the Japanese, the annihilation of Ichiki's detachment was a shattering revelation. An entire regiment had been destroyed in a single night. The Americans had not panicked under darkness. They had not broken under the ferocity of a banzai charge. They had calmly held their ground, waited for their enemy to enter pre-planned killing zones, and obliterated them with mechanical efficiency. Captured reports and post-war testimonies reveal the depth of Japanese shock. They had encountered a new kind of enemy, disciplined, vital, and tactically flexible. The Browning machine guns had performed flawlessly. The Marines' ammunition supplies seemed limitless. Every rifle was clean, every weapon functional. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese soldiers realized that American industry and precision could be just as deadly as Japanese courage. The artillery support available to the Marines on Guadalcanal far exceeded anything the Japanese could deploy. Each U.S. infantry regiment had its own integrated artillery battalion, capable of coordinating precise fire missions with infantry and even naval gunfire from destroyers and cruisers stationed offshore. It was an interlocking web of destruction that Japanese forces had never encountered before. Every American unit could call on pre-registered artillery and mortar fire, while forward observers and radio operators could summon naval salvos within minutes. The result was a level of combined arms coordination that the Imperial Japanese Army, trained for frontal assaults and rigid battle plans, was wholly unprepared to face. Within days of the Tenaru disaster, Japan had already begun preparing for a new attempt to retake Henderson Field. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, orchestrated a large-scale reinforcement operation to support the ground assault. On August 16th, 3 slow transport ships departed Truk Lagoon, carrying the remaining 1,400 soldiers from Colonel Ichiki's regiment, along with 500 Special Naval Landing Force Marines. However, the subsequent Battle of the Eastern Solomons on August 24th ended in disaster for Japan. American carrier aircraft inflicted severe damage, sinking one transport and crippling another. In response, Japanese command abandoned the use of slow transports altogether. Instead, they adopted a high-speed reinforcement method, destroyers running supplies and troops to Guadalcanal under cover of darkness, the infamous Tokyo Express. Between August 29th and September 4th, Japanese destroyers and light cruisers made multiple runs to Taivu Point, landing nearly 5,000 soldiers of Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade. The system worked brilliantly for moving men. A destroyer could make the 560-mile round trip from the Shortland Islands to Guadalcanal and back in a single night, minimizing exposure to daytime air attacks from Henderson Field. But this method had a fatal flaw. Heavy equipment could not be transported by destroyer, field artillery, tanks, trucks, and even sufficient ammunition had to be left behind. Each soldier carried only what he could pack on his back, typically a rifle, 100 rounds of ammunition, and 3 days of rice. As the campaign dragged on, Japanese troops would not only battle American firepower, but also malnutrition, exhaustion, and disease. Many soldiers lost over 20 pounds in a matter of weeks. Some Japanese accounts later described the campaign not as a battle against the Americans, but a battle against hunger itself. General Kiyotake Kawaguchi set September 12, 1942, as the date for his assault on Henderson Field. His operational plan called for a 3-pronged attack. One force would strike from the west along the coastal plain, another would attack from the south through dense jungle, believed by Japanese intelligence to be the Americans' weakest point, and Kawaguchi himself would lead the main effort along an inland ridge dominating the airfield. What Kawaguchi did not realize was that Marine intelligence had already predicted this move. Aerial reconnaissance and captured Japanese documents had revealed troop movements converging south of the airfield. On September 8th, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt, Red Mike Edson, commander of the elite 1st Marine Raider Battalion, led a raid on Tasamoko village. There he discovered large supply dumps and fresh signs of troop activity, proof that a major attack was imminent. Edson correctly deduced the Japanese plan. They would advance along the ridge from the south in an attempt to break through to Henderson Field. With General Vandegrift's approval, Edson requested permission to occupy and fortify the ridge itself. On September 10th and 11th, roughly 840 Marines, a mix of Edson's Raiders and the 1st Parachute Battalion, dug in along the ridge. Their defensive preparations mirrored the disciplined precision seen at Tenaru. Machine guns were arranged to create interlocking fields of fire. Mortars were zeroed in on likely approach routes. Artillery batteries from the 11th Marines plotted defensive fire missions in advance. The ridge, later immortalized as Edson's Ridge, was a narrow coral spine about 1,000 meters long, consisting of 3 small knolls covered in kunai grass and sparse trees. Deep ravines bordered both sides, heavily wooded and nearly impassable, terrain ideal for infiltration. For an attacking army, it was a nightmare of narrow defiles and zero visibility. For a prepared defender, it was a perfect killing ground. On the night of September 12th, Kawaguchi's men began their assault. Unlike Ichiki's reckless frontal charge at Tenaru, this attack was far more complex. Japanese infantry units crept through the ravines on both sides of the ridge, seeking to envelop and cut off Marine positions. Small squads probed for weak points, followed by concentrated waves attempting to exploit any breach. The jungle erupted into chaos. In the blackness, battles were fought at point-blank range. Marines fired flares that illuminated the ridge in eerie red light, revealing hundreds of figures moving among the trees. In some places, hand-to-hand combat broke out as Japanese soldiers infiltrated to within grenade range. The fight for Edson's Ridge had begun, a brutal all-night struggle that would test every ounce of the Marines' endurance and discipline and determine the fate of Henderson Field itself. Despite the ferocity of the Japanese onslaught, the Marine defensive preparations held firm. Whenever Japanese units massed for breakthrough attempts, Marine mortars and artillery responded with devastating precision. Throughout the night, the 11th Marines fired over 2,000 rounds of high-explosive shells, so close to friendly positions that fragments occasionally wounded Marines manning the lines. Machine gun crews fired continuously until their barrels glowed red, pausing only long enough to swap out overheated weapons or pour water from canteens to cool them down. The fighting quickly devolved into close-quarters chaos. Individual Marines used whatever they could find, rifles, pistols, knives, entrenching tools, to fend off Japanese soldiers who slipped through the perimeter. Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza, the same Solomon Island scout who had warned of the earlier Tenaru attack, once again proved invaluable. Moving through the darkness and smoke, he pointed out infiltration routes and encouraged exhausted men to hold their ground. At one critical machine gun position, Sergeant John Basiloni fought almost single-handedly after his crew was killed or wounded. Working two heavy .30 caliber guns, he maintained a constant stream of fire, repelling multiple assaults and keeping the Japanese from overrunning the line. His courage under impossible conditions would earn him the Medal of Honor and make him one of the most celebrated Marines of the war. In total, 2 Marines received the Medal of Honor for their actions at Edson's Ridge, and 19 others earned the Navy Cross. When dawn broke on September 13th, the ridge was littered with the bodies of hundreds of Japanese soldiers. Kawaguchi's forces had failed to break through, but the general still had reserves. Determined to seize Henderson Field, he prepared to renew the assault that night. Recognizing the danger, Colonel Edson ordered his men to withdraw slightly and consolidate at the center of the ridge, tightening their defensive line. General Vandegrift reinforced the position with additional troops, bringing the total defending force to around 2,500 men. The second night's fighting proved even more brutal than the first. Kawaguchi threw everything he had into one last desperate push before daylight could bring American aircraft to bear. Japanese soldiers charged again and again into the fields of fire, dying by the hundreds. Some waves came within 50 yards of Edson's command post before being cut down. The air was thick with the stench of cordite and burning grass. At one point, the situation grew so dire that Edson himself picked up a rifle, moving among his men and firing alongside them to steady the line. But the Americans had prepared too well. Their artillery coordination, overlapping machine gun nests, and sheer determination shattered every Japanese attempt. By dawn on September 14th, Kawaguchi's offensive had collapsed completely. Of the 3,000 men who had launched the attack, an estimated 830 to 850 were killed, with hundreds more wounded or missing. The Marines suffered 104 killed and over 200 wounded, most from the Raider and parachute battalions. The ridge, known thereafter as Bloody Ridge, or more honorably Edson's Ridge, had become a symbol of Marine tenacity and the power of coordinated defense. For the Japanese who survived, the battle was a psychological turning point. Captured diaries and post-war accounts revealed deep shock and disbelief. They had expected to dominate the night through stealth and bayonet attacks, but instead found themselves facing an enemy who turned the darkness against them, guided by pre-sighted artillery, flares, and overlapping fields of automatic fire. Their courage and discipline were undeniable, yet courage alone could not overcome the American mastery of combined arms. The twin battles of Tenaru and Edson's Ridge set the pattern for the rest of the Guadalcanal Campaign. The Japanese would continue to launch night assaults, relying on spirit, speed, and the bayonet. The Americans would counter with overwhelming firepower, superior logistics, and meticulous preparation. The result was tragically consistent. Japanese losses were catastrophic, while American casualties, though heavy, remained sustainable. Yet numbers alone cannot convey the true horror of Guadalcanal. The island itself became a second enemy. Malaria, dysentery, and jungle rot ravaged both sides. By December 1942, the 1st Marine Division reported over 8,000 cases of malaria, and nearly two-thirds of its men were rendered unfit for combat at some point during the campaign. Tropical ulcers ate through flesh, and the relentless humidity turned every cut into a potential infection. Soldiers fought the jungle as fiercely as they fought each other. The victory at Edson's Ridge secured Henderson Field, ensuring that the Americans would retain air superiority over the Solomon Islands. It marked a decisive turning point, not only in the Guadalcanal Campaign, but in the entire Pacific War. From that ridge of coral and blood, the momentum began to shift, and Japan's long advance across the Pacific came to an end. By October, conditions on Guadalcanal had deteriorated into a battle of endurance as much as firepower. For both sides, disease and hunger became as deadly as bullets, but the contrast between American and Japanese logistics was stark. For the Marines, hardship was constant but survivable. Dental problems and untreated infections took their toll, yet most wounded received prompt care. Field hospitals on the island had surgical capabilities, plasma for transfusions, and sulfa drugs to fight infection, luxuries the Japanese could only dream of. Though early naval setbacks briefly cut off supply lines in August and early September, by October the Cactus Air Force, operating from Henderson Field, ensured reliable air cover for supply convoys. Food, ammunition, and medical supplies arrived regularly, and when shortages occurred, they were temporary. Marines ate canned sea rations and spam, unappetizing but nutritionally sufficient. Ammunition was abundant enough that machine gun crews could expend thousands of rounds in a night and request replacements without hesitation. For the Japanese, conditions were catastrophic. The nightly Tokyo Express destroyer runs could deliver men but almost no heavy supplies. Rations meant for a day had to stretch into 3. Soldiers often survived on a handful of rice and whatever they could forage, coconuts, roots, even snakes or insects. Captured diaries later revealed that starvation was so severe that some troops resorted to eating tree bark and leather equipment. A Japanese field medical report from late October recorded that over 60% of the 17th Army was incapacitated by malnutrition and disease, with overall combat strength reduced to barely 30% of authorized manpower. Soldiers were dying at a rate of 50 per day, most from starvation or infection rather than combat. Quinine for malaria prevention had run out months earlier, and there was no adequate resupply. Medical equipment was primitive, often limited to a bandage, if that. Many wounded were left to die or given grenades to end their lives rather than slow their comrades. A Japanese medic later wrote, "We have more men dying from lack of food than from enemy fire." Despite this desperation, Tokyo demanded one final offensive to reclaim Henderson Field. On October 23, 1942, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, commander of the 17th Army, personally arrived on Guadalcanal to lead the operation. Reinforcements from the elite 2nd Division, veterans of the China campaigns, bolstered his confidence. The plan called for a coordinated, multi-directional attack, a diversionary strike from the west, and a main assault from the south through the dense jungle, using the same approach as the earlier Bloody Ridge attack, but this time with greater numbers and artillery support. The offensive began with a western feint across the Meticulously River on October 23rd. 9 Japanese Type 97 Chiha medium tanks, a rare sight on Guadalcanal, led the assault. However, waiting Marines and soldiers of the newly arrived 164th Infantry Regiment, North Dakota National Guard, were ready. American 37mm anti-tank guns, M3 Stuart light tanks, and artillery fire destroyed all 9 Japanese tanks within minutes. The attack collapsed with over 600 casualties, signaling that the Japanese were again underestimating American defenses. The main assault began the following night, October 24th to 25th, when roughly 5,600 troops under Major General Yumio Nasu attacked from the south. Their objective, break through the American lines and seize Henderson Field. Facing them were Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Chesty Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, reinforced by the 164th Infantry Regiment. What followed was one of the most ferocious nights in Marine Corps history. The jungle erupted with machine gun fire, explosions, and screams. Waves of Japanese soldiers charged through the darkness. their attacks illuminated by flares and tracer rounds. Each breakthrough was met with immediate counterattacks as Marines and soldiers fought shoulder to shoulder in the mud and rain. Artillery from the 11th Marines fired danger-close missions, landing shells within 75 yards of friendly positions. The barrage was so intense that it was said to have mowed down entire companies at a time. Offshore, U.S. Navy battleships and cruisers, including the USS Washington, stood ready to provide fire support if Henderson Field was threatened. At one point, only a single Marine battalion stood between the Japanese and the airfield, but they refused to yield. Amid the chaos, Sergeant John Basilone, already a legend from the Battle of Bloody Ridge, once again became a cornerstone of the defense. When his section's ammunition ran dangerously low, Basilone personally carried belts of machine gun rounds through enemy fire, ensuring his guns never went silent. He repaired jammed weapons under fire and held his position until relief arrived. His heroism during the October battle earned him the Medal of Honor, symbolizing the resolve of every Marine who fought on Guadalcanal. By dawn on October 26th, the Japanese offensive had been crushed. More than 3,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead, their bodies strewn across the jungle south of Henderson Field. American casualties numbered fewer than 300 killed and wounded. The failure of the October offensive marked the final Japanese attempt to retake Guadalcanal by land. The outcome was decisive. Not merely a tactical victory, but a strategic turning point. Japan had expended its best troops and could no longer replace them at the same rate. Disease, starvation, and relentless air and naval attacks eroded what remained of its fighting power. In contrast, the Americans grew stronger with each passing month, their logistics improving and reinforcements arriving steadily. By early 1943, the last Japanese survivors would be evacuated under the cover of darkness. The campaign that began in August 1942 had lasted 6 grueling months and cost Japan over 25,000 men, while American losses totaled around 7,100. But Guadalcanal's importance went far beyond numbers. It marked the first time Japan's advance across the Pacific had been stopped cold. From the steaming jungles of that haunted island, the long road to Tokyo had begun. The battle for Guadalcanal reached its bloody climax in late October 1942. When one gun position was overrun, a Marine grabbed his .45 pistol and led a desperate counterattack that restored the line. By dawn on October 25th, the Japanese offensive had failed. General Nasu was dead, cut down by machine gun fire during one of the night attacks. More than 2,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead on the battlefield. American casualties, though severe, numbered in the hundreds, heavy but sustainable. October also marked the beginning of a new phase in the struggle, the battle for control of the seas. The naval battle of Guadalcanal, fought from November 12th to 15th, became one of the most brutal surface engagements in naval history. In the confused nighttime chaos of November 13th, American cruisers and destroyers clashed at close range with a Japanese bombardment force that included the battleships Hiei and Kirishima. Rear Admirals Daniel Callahan and Norman Scott, two of the Navy's most respected officers, were both killed, the only U.S. flag officers lost in surface combat during the entire war. The Americans paid dearly, losing 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers, with 3 more heavily damaged. Yet their sacrifice achieved what mattered most. Hiei was crippled, later sunk by aircraft, and the Japanese bombardment failed. Henderson Field, the lifeline of the Marines, remained operational. The Japanese tried again the following night, sending Kirishima to complete the mission. This time, the battleships Washington and South Dakota intercepted her. Using radar-directed gunnery, a revolutionary advantage, Washington scored 9 direct hits with 16-inch shells, reducing Kirishima to a burning wreck before she slipped beneath the waves. Even more devastating for Japan, American aircraft and surface ships annihilated a major convoy attempting to land the 38th Division with tanks and heavy artillery. Of 11 transports, only 4 reached Guadalcanal, and all were destroyed by air and artillery before unloading. Over 5,000 Japanese soldiers died in that single effort. The loss marked the final major attempt to reinforce or resupply Guadalcanal. For the Japanese troops still stranded on the island, November was the beginning of starvation and despair. They had expected food, medicine, and reinforcements. Instead, they received nothing. Rations were cut again, eventually to a single rice ball a day. Malaria and dysentery spread unchecked. Field hospitals became places of slow death. Captured diaries from the period described men eating grass, bark, or even poisonous plants in desperation. Bodies were burned when comrades had the strength, otherwise they were left to decay in the jungle. By December, even the Japanese high command recognized the hopelessness of the situation. From Rabaul came the secret order to evacuate Guadalcanal, a mission codenamed Operation K, Publicly, Tokyo called it a strategic withdrawal, but privately, it was the quiet admission of defeat. Of the 36,000 Japanese who had landed on Guadalcanal, only about 11,000 remained by early 1943, and fewer than 7,000 were still capable of walking. Between February 1st and 7th, 1943, in one of their few successful operations of the campaign, the Japanese Navy evacuated 10,652 survivors under the cover of darkness. It was a remarkable feat of seamanship and discipline, but it could not hide the disaster that had unfolded. Of the original 36,000 Japanese soldiers sent to Guadalcanal, roughly 25,000 to 30,000 perished, about 15,000 in combat, and another 10,000 to 15,000 from starvation and disease. The Americans, though bloodied, had endured. The Marines and Army units that fought on Guadalcanal suffered thousands of casualties, but they held the island. Guadalcanal was more than a victory. It was the turning point of the Pacific War. The myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered. From that moment on, the initiative in the Pacific would belong to the Allies. By early 1943, the American victory on Guadalcanal was undeniable, but it had come at a cost. Approximately 1,600 U.S. personnel were killed in action, over 4,200 wounded, and several thousand more were temporarily disabled by malaria and other tropical diseases. Yet, for the United States, these losses were sustainable. American industry was producing ships, aircraft, and munitions faster than they could be destroyed. New divisions were already training to replace the exhausted veterans. For the first time in the Pacific War, the strategic initiative had permanently shifted from Japan to the United States. The psychological impact of Guadalcanal on Japanese military thought cannot be overstated. It was the first campaign where Japanese forces suffered a decisive defeat in sustained ground combat. Every offensive had failed. Every application of traditional Japanese tactical doctrine, night attacks, infiltration, and reliance on spiritual power had resulted in catastrophe. The myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered. Japanese officers who survived the campaign later admitted that Guadalcanal exposed fatal flaws in their military system. In post-war interviews and memoirs, several consistent themes emerged. First, they had vastly underestimated American fighting ability. Second, the disparity in logistics, firepower, and equipment was far greater than they had imagined. Third, Japan's supply system was fundamentally incapable of sustaining prolonged operations against an enemy that dominated sea and air. Finally, they realized that courage and tactical skill could not compensate for systemic inferiority. The Americans had systems for logistics, for medical care, for artillery coordination, for communication. Every system worked. The Japanese had almost none. Veterans of the campaign described how American troops maintained discipline and combat effectiveness despite disease, exhaustion, and terrible conditions. They credited this not to individual toughness alone, but to organization and supply. Food, medicine, and ammunition reached the front lines. Artillery and air support were available when needed. American forces could sustain high rates of fire because they had the logistical backbone to do so. Technological and material differences also played a critical role. Japanese infantry primarily used the Arisaka bolt-action rifle, a reliable but slow weapon. American Marines initially carried similar M1903 Springfields, but as the campaign continued, increasing numbers were equipped with the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic rifle with an 8-round clip. The Garand's faster rate of fire gave American troops a decisive edge in close combat. Machine guns told an even clearer story. The American Browning M1917, A1, water-cooled and belt-fed, could fire continuously for long periods as long as ammunition and cooling water were available. In contrast, the Japanese Type 96 and Type 99 light machine guns, while portable, overheated quickly and lacked sustained fire capability. In defensive engagements, where Marines often had time to prepare overlapping fields of fire, this difference was devastating. Artillery superiority may have been the most decisive factor of all. The 11th Marines used 75mm M1A1 pack howitzers, which could be broken down and carried through dense jungle. Forward observers with frontline units could request fire missions and receive accurate support within minutes. Japanese artillery, limited in number and perpetually short on ammunition, simply could not compete. Moreover, American destroyers and cruisers offshore added another layer of lethal firepower. Coordinated through radio, naval gunfire could strike Japanese troop concentrations or defensive positions with pinpoint accuracy. Air power further solidified American dominance. The Cactus Air Force, operating from Henderson Field under near impossible conditions, grew stronger each month. Marine and Army Air Force pilots flying F-4F Wildcats, P-39 Airacobras, and P-40 Warhawks intercepted Japanese bombers and fighters, while SBD Dauntless dive bombers struck enemy positions in shipping. Japanese aircraft from Rabaul were forced to fly at extreme range, giving them only minutes over target and little room for error. By January 1943, the balance of power had completely reversed. Major General Alexander Patch's 14th Corps, a joint force of Marine and Army divisions, launched a final offensive to eliminate the last Japanese positions. With overwhelming artillery, naval, and air support, American forces advanced methodically, crushing resistance that once seemed unbreakable. Guadalcanal was more than a battle, it was a turning point in modern warfare. It marked the end of Japan's expansion and the beginning of a long, relentless American counteroffensive. The lessons learned there, the importance of logistics, coordination, and industrial strength, would shape every Pacific campaign that followed, from Tarawa to Okinawa. By early February 1943, the once fierce Japanese defense on Guadalcanal had finally collapsed. What remained of their army, reduced to starving remnants, slipped away under cover of night in one of the most remarkable evacuations of the war. On February 9th, American patrols confirmed what aerial reconnaissance had already suspected. The Japanese had withdrawn completely. General Alexander Patch sent a brief but historic message to Admiral William Halsey. Tokyo Express no longer has a terminus on Guadalcanal. The 6-month campaign was over. The Battle of Guadalcanal had cost both sides dearly, but it marked the first major American ground victory against Japan. More than that, it became the template for every future Pacific operation. The campaign revealed, with brutal clarity, the principles that would decide the war: air and naval superiority, reliable logistics, coordinated firepower, and industrial capacity. For Japan, it was a devastating revelation, one that should have rewritten its entire military doctrine. Japanese officers who survived or studied the campaign were forced to confront truths their leaders had long denied. The myth of Japanese warrior invincibility had been shattered. Courage and tactical brilliance could not overcome starvation, disease, or overwhelming firepower. Night attacks and close combat assaults, once successful in China, failed disastrously against entrenched American defenses supported by artillery and aircraft. Japanese supply and communication systems simply couldn't sustain prolonged combat. As Colonel Masanobu Tsuoi, a staff officer who visited Guadalcanal, later wrote, "We fought a battle of spirit against a nation that fought a battle of machines." Tsuji and others recognized a grim truth. Japan was engaged in an industrial war it could never win. The United States was producing more ships, planes, and munitions each month than Japan could in a year. By late 1942, American factories were launching nearly 3 aircraft carriers per month and producing over 4,000 aircraft monthly, while Japan struggled to replace even a fraction of its losses. The material disparity doomed Japan's war effort long before many of its leaders would admit it. Yet Japan's military culture, steeped in centuries of warrior tradition and the romantic ideal of death before dishonor, could not easily accept this strategic reality. The official explanation for the defeat on Guadalcanal blamed poor logistics, naval setbacks, and the unexpected resilience of American defenses. Few dared to admit that Japanese tactical doctrine itself had become obsolete. The emphasis on personal valor, bayonet charges, and nighttime assaults, so effective against poorly equipped Chinese armies, was suicidal against a modern mechanized enemy with superior coordination, communication, and firepower. Those who survived Guadalcanal emerged transformed. Many later testified that the campaign was the first time they realized Japan would ultimately lose the war. They had entered the island as proud warriors of an unstoppable empire and left it as emaciated, disease-ridden men haunted by starvation and defeat. Their diaries and post-war testimonies revealed deep disillusionment. They had been taught that Americans were soft and lacked fighting spirit, yet on Guadalcanal they found a disciplined, organized, and relentless opponent who fought with precision and purpose. From the American perspective, Guadalcanal was equally transformative. For the Marines and soldiers who fought there, it proved that American troops could match and defeat the Japanese in the most brutal jungle conditions imaginable. The myth of Japanese invincibility was destroyed, replaced by confidence tempered with respect. American commanders learned that combined arms warfare, integrating infantry, artillery, air, and naval support, could overcome even the most determined enemy. At the same time, U.S. forces came to respect the ferocity and endurance of their enemy. Japanese troops continued fighting despite hopeless odds, starvation, and disease. They refused to surrender even when surrounded. The contrast between the two sides' treatment of prisoners highlighted profound cultural differences. American forces dropped surrender leaflets, offered food and medical care, and broadcast radio messages encouraging Japanese troops to give up. Yet these efforts achieved almost nothing. Out of roughly 36,000 Japanese soldiers who served on Guadalcanal, fewer than 1,000 were captured alive, and nearly all were too sick or wounded to resist. Strategically, Guadalcanal marked a turning point in the Pacific War. Japan's failure to retake Henderson Field and the eventual evacuation of its troops proved that the so-called defensive perimeter of the Japanese Empire could be broken. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once feared as the strongest in the Pacific, had been crippled. The loss of Guadalcanal forced Japan onto the defensive, while the United States seized the initiative, beginning a relentless island-hopping campaign that would carry its forces across the Pacific to the shores of Japan itself. Guadalcanal was more than a battlefield victory. It was the moment the Pacific balance of power shifted irreversibly. It demonstrated that modern war was not won by courage alone, but by the mastery of logistics, technology, and coordination. The jungle island that few had heard of in 1942 became the graveyard of Japanese expansion and the birthplace of Allied victory in the Pacific. The Battle of Guadalcanal ended not only as a tactical victory, but as a strategic and psychological turning point in the Pacific War. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Allied forces had seized the initiative. From this moment onward, the war in the Pacific would be fought on American terms, through relentless offensive operations supported by overwhelming industrial power. The lessons learned on Guadalcanal reshaped Allied strategy. Defensive operations gave way to coordinated offensives, each one aimed at rolling back the Japanese perimeter island by island. The massive industrial output of the United States, tanks, ships, aircraft, and ammunition produced in quantities the Axis could never match, could now be systematically translated into victory. Japan's defeat on Guadalcanal had revealed a truth its leaders could no longer ignore. They were fighting an industrial superpower with resources and logistics far beyond their reach. The Japanese decision to evacuate Guadalcanal in February 1943, though quietly made, was a tacit admission that they could not sustain attritional warfare against American production and organization. The loss of tens of thousands of men, experienced pilots, and irreplaceable ships crippled Japan's ability to ever regain the initiative. From then on, every Japanese campaign would be a desperate defensive struggle, fought with dwindling resources. For those who fought there, Guadalcanal left scars that lasted a lifetime. The survivors of the U.S. 1st Marine Division, evacuated in December 1942, were physically exhausted and ravaged by malaria, malnutrition, and combat stress. They required months of rest and recovery before returning to battle. Yet these veterans became invaluable instructors and leaders, spreading the hard-earned lessons of jungle warfare, defensive coordination, and amphibious operations throughout the growing Allied forces. The Japanese survivors of Operation Key, the evacuation effort, faced a different fate. Dispersed among other Pacific garrisons, they carried with them the psychological burden of defeat, the realization that the Americans were not only brave, but systematically stronger in every measurable way. Many of these men would later die on islands like Tarawa, Saipan, or Leyte, fighting battles that repeated Guadalcanal's grim pattern on an even larger scale. Even decades after the war, Guadalcanal itself bore the scars of the 6-month campaign. Rusted wreckage of aircraft and ships lay scattered along the coasts. Jungle paths still concealed unexploded shells and abandoned weapons. Henderson Field, once a muddy airstrip wrested from the jungle, grew into a major Allied base, the launch point for the continued push through the Solomon Islands toward Rabaul and beyond. For military historians, Guadalcanal became a case study in modern warfare, a campaign that tested every aspect of military science: amphibious landings, logistics under fire, jungle combat, and the integration of land, sea, and air power into a single, coordinated system. It demonstrated with terrible clarity that modern war was not won by bravery alone. Victory demanded industrial capacity, organization, communication, and above all, logistics. The human cost was staggering. More than 7,000 Americans and Japanese died in the naval battles around the island. On land, American casualties exceeded 7,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Japanese losses surpassed 30,000, the majority from starvation, disease, and exhaustion rather than direct combat. Thousands more suffered lifelong effects from tropical diseases, wounds, and psychological trauma. Yet, militarily, the sacrifice achieved its purpose. It turned the tide of the Pacific War. Guadalcanal was where two philosophies of war collided. Japan's belief in the supremacy of the warrior spirit, that courage and determination could overcome material inferiority, met America's belief in the systematic application of industrial power, logistics, and technology. The jungle of Guadalcanal became the crucible that tested both ideas to destruction. The result was unmistakable. Courage alone could not defeat coordination, firepower, and supply. For Japanese soldiers who survived, Guadalcanal destroyed a lifetime of illusion. They learned that their training and doctrine had been shaped by an outdated conception of warfare, one that glorified sacrifice but ignored logistics and adaptability. Their nation was fighting a war that could not be won through heroism or willpower alone. For the Americans, Guadalcanal provided confidence tempered by respect. They proved that they could match the Japanese in endurance and ferocity. They learned that industrial power, when organized and directed efficiently, could be transformed into battlefield dominance. And they shattered forever the myth of Japanese invincibility. From the smoking jungles of Guadalcanal emerged not only the first great American victory of the Pacific War, but the blueprint for how that war would be won. The myth of Japanese invincibility shattered on Guadalcanal, replaced by a far more realistic understanding of the enemy, one that was courageous and disciplined, but ultimately defeatable in the face of superior organization and resources. Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal were not broken by the fighting spirit of individual Americans, though U.S. Marines and soldiers proved formidable in close combat. What truly terrified them was the systematic, unending, and mechanical nature of American warfare, a style of combat that combined firepower, logistics, and technology into a relentless engine of destruction. It was not fear of death that haunted the Japanese on Guadalcanal. Death was something they had been trained to embrace. Rather, it was the dawning realization that sacrifice and courage alone meant nothing against an enemy whose supplies seemed infinite, whose artillery never fell silent, whose aircraft ruled the skies day and night, and whose wounded were evacuated, treated, and returned to the fight. The Americans, supported by an industrial machine producing over 96,000 aircraft and 65,000 tanks annually by 1943, could replace every loss many times over. Japan, by contrast, struggled to build a fraction of that output and could not replenish its dwindling reserves of trained pilots or modern equipment. The Japanese defenders watched in disbelief as American naval convoys delivered a constant stream of ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements to Henderson Field, while their own supply lines were strangled by U.S. submarines and aircraft. Hunger, disease, and exhaustion did more to cripple the Imperial Army than enemy bullets. At its worst, Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal received as little as half a cup of rice per day, while American troops ate canned rations, received mail, and used medical supplies that arrived almost daily. This was the true turning point of the Pacific War, the moment when Japan's officers realized that they were no longer fighting a regional opponent, but a global industrial power capable of sustaining war indefinitely. From Guadalcanal onward, Japan would never again seize the initiative. Every campaign that followed, from Tarawa to Iwo Jima, was fought under the same grim equation: shrinking resources, declining morale, and an ever-growing American arsenal. Guadalcanal became the template for modern jungle warfare, proving that success in such brutal conditions depended not just on bravery, but on logistics, coordination, and firepower. The lessons learned there reshaped Allied doctrine: integrate air, naval, light, and ground forces, maintain continuous resupply, and control the skies. It also reshaped psychology. For American troops, Guadalcanal proved that Japan could be beaten. For Japanese soldiers, it proved that the empire's strategy was fatally flawed. In the steaming jungles of Guadalcanal, the Pacific War entered a new phase. The warrior spirit of Japan met the industrial power of America, and from that collision, the outcome of the entire conflict was decided.